Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. 100 years ago, the suffragettes battled for women's rights. Half a century ago, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. And here we are, all these years later, and still women are not free and equal. Wherever we look, we see glass ceilings, fewer opportunities, lower incomes. We see a rape conviction rate barely above 5%, and millions of women around the world enslaved in the sex industry. Quite clearly, women's liberation is an idea, but not yet a reality. With me to discuss the ongoing battle for justice for women is Julie Bindel, a founder of the feminist law firm Justice for Women. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Peter.
I just want to start perhaps by getting your view about what are the key pressing issues in Britain today in terms of women's continuing second-class legal status.
Well, there are many issues, but I think the one that unites women everywhere, of all cultures and class backgrounds and social standing, is sexual violence, is male violence. And it takes many forms, and it can begin in childhood with child sexual abuse and go right through to murder, to domestic homicide. And in between you have all kinds of issues, domestic violence, you have prostitution and pimping and rape, as you pointed out. So that's the one issue where women everywhere are united.
And it seems to be an issue which we haven't really properly addressed.
Well, we haven't. I mean, we've made great inroads. For example, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, people wouldn't speak of domestic violence in the way they do now. The police didn't respond to it as a crime. In fact, 40 years ago, it wasn't a crime. And now, of course, people's consciousnesses have been raised about it. We have conferences on it. The government have strategised on it. But we haven't seen a fall in the domestic homicide rate. That's 2 women per week killed as a result of domestic violence since we began to collect the statistics. So what is going wrong? Why hasn't it really saved women's lives?
And what, in your view, is the answer to that question? Why?
I think because men still haven't got it. Those men who feel able to hit women with impunity and excuse themselves and other men, who think that rape is justified, who believe that murder is simply provocation gone too far, who think that pimping women into the sex industry is after all just her choice and just a job. I think they haven't been properly educated to recognise women as equal to them, and we need to start as early as possible educating men and also make them realise that there are consequences if they do harm women and children. And quite frankly, I think that the majority of men know that they can get away with it.
I mean, you've emphasised or mentioned education. I guess that really is pretty fundamental to this whole equation. We don't have in our schools much awareness about women's issues and violence in the home. Those kind of issues are regarded as just not really on the radar at all.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you think about how when we began the education process about HIV, we had, I mean, it was much criticised and rightly so, but a long-running government campaign to re-educate people about safe sex, about safer sex. And when that fell off the radar, rates of HIV infection started to rise again. And what we know from that is unless you keep plugging the message continually, you'll get a burst of consciousness in some areas of society from some people, and others will be left ignorant or they'll forget the message. Now, one good example about continual public education campaigns that have worked is the drink driving campaign. Now, with that, you have 2 things going on. One, you have an awareness raising campaign which says if you go out and drive really quickly down a country lane after 10 pints of beer, you might kill someone, you might kill yourself. You would be a scumbag and there's no excuse for you to do it. Okay? So you have appealing to someone's better nature, and, by the way, if you do it, you could be facing 5 years in prison. Now, if you had the same for domestic violence and rape, for example, first, don't do it, it's horrible, it's not a victimless crime, and secondly, and by the way, if you do, you will go to prison, then it's a 2-pronged approach. But the government has never, ever put the resources into a long-standing, long-term, huge advertising and awareness campaign on violence against women. It's not a priority.
It seems so obvious. Such an obvious, simple thing to do.
Well, it is. And I mean, if you look, for example, countries like Sweden, where they've introduced legislation, which is fantastic in my view, to decriminalise women in prostitution, in fact, all people in prostitution who are selling sex, but criminalise those who wish to buy sex. They haven't just actually put men who want to buy sex in prison or in the gallows or in the stocks and humiliated them. No, what they've done is they've educated children growing up in Sweden about prostitution. The government has said, this is abuse of women. No modern society should sell women and children's bodies or buy them. On the other hand, the government said, and we're going to help women get out of this industry. And by the way, men, because it largely is men, if you do buy sex, you are committing a crime and you will have a criminal record against your name. And that mix of public education and a warning about the sanctions and the consequences is a really powerful tool, but you can't have one without the other. It doesn't work.
Has it actually reduced the incidence in Sweden?
It has. I mean, obviously, you can't just displace prostitution. You know, you can't just crack down in one particular area and expect it solves the problem. That's usually just a sort of street cleaning exercise to satisfy residents and business people who don't really care about the women. But what it's done is something really interesting. Unlike the Netherlands, where children grow up to see prostitution as a service industry, as going out and buying a McDonald's because it's legalised, Swedish children grow up realising that actually this is not something that is conducive with equality between men and women. You can't buy one sex, you can't sell one sex. And so in Sweden, the last survey was that 80% of all citizens, 7 years after this law was passed, support it. And they support it for the right reasons. Not because it's about anti-sex, right-wing Christian morality, but it's about social justice. And children are starting to get that. And yes, it has reduced prostitution. And more interestingly, trafficking into Sweden has reduced because the pimps know that they won't get a friendly reception.
So what you're saying, it's really a combination of education, and after all, you're right, if we can have education about combating racism in schools, why not about domestic violence and rape?
Absolutely, and I think that like education, and we don't have enough of it, but education about racism and the harms of racism, you also have another tool to tackle it, which is the incitement to racial hatred legislation, which I'm all for adapting and broadening to include incitement to sexual hatred. Now, there's often a crossover, of course, the rape of black women by white men, etc. But sexual hatred is very prevalent, and some of the publications, and I'm against state censorship entirely, but if we had that legislation, we could look at some of the publications that promote misogyny, that promote the most appalling messages about women that can lead to the way men treat women. You can actually take those publications off the shelf and out of distribution through that legislation, which is progressive, rather than state-induced censorship, which is usually, as you know, usually very reactionary and misguided.
And I've got a lot of sympathy to that point of view, but I would have some concern about how would it be enforced and who would interpret this law and where would you draw the line. Just to give you an example, in the campaign against homophobic singers and artists, like the ones from Jamaica, you know, our campaign has not been against those who incite hatred or abuse against gay people. It's been against those who explicitly incite violence and murder. That's where we've chosen to draw the line. Now, I can see, you know, what constitutes hatred is a very grey area, and I say I'm sympathetic, but I'm just worried. How would you draw the line, and who would draw the line, and how would it be enforced?
Well, I think we do need to take our analogy from the campaigns against homophobia, from the campaigns against incitement to racial hatred. We know what misogyny looks like, if we're honest. We know that the images of women on all fours who are portrayed in an animalistic way with absolutely no agency or control themselves, where they are depicted in pornography as objects to be penetrated, where the images of women in pornography seem to be to incite further harm upon her. In other words, as she's being raped or doubly penetrated, she's calling out, crying out for more, she loves being hurt. I think similarly with the humiliation and the images of black people within some popular culture, you know, it's about stripping them of their basic dignity and human rights. Now, one person might, I mean, Anne Widdecombe would have something very different to say than I do about what is a negative depiction of women. And I do think that, you know, as progressives, we need to look at liberation struggles of the past and look at what, you know, our foremothers said, people who were very, very clued into what constitutes humiliation, degradation, and dehumanises people, and we need to take our lead from that.
I think you've given some obvious pointers about areas where progress could be made. What about other issues that you feel are absent in terms of addressing women's agenda today?
Well, I think that the key issue, as I've said, is sexual violence. There's no question about that. I mean, there are obvious ones in terms of, you know, you mentioned the glass ceiling, you know, you mentioned low pay, and there are issues to do with, you know, the unfair distribution of childcare. But
I mean, that to me is an absolute. I mean, this government has made some efforts towards addressing, you know, the lack of affordable childcare,
yes,
but still, it is woefully inadequate. Yes. And if we want women to have equal opportunity, surely we've got to deal with that fundamental issue of childcare. We
do. I think it's a lot less contentious than rape. It's a lot less contentious than prostitution. Decent childcare benefits men also, which, you know, coming down hard on issues of sexual violence will benefit men in the long run, but it certainly doesn't feel like a benefit to those who are being told they can't hit their wife, they can't rape a woman who comes onto them at a party. So I think it's a far easier fight in a way, and certainly the government has not put its money where its mouth is to the extent that it promised, but I do believe we'll get there in the end. I mean, for example, you know, I'm someone who cares for an adult with a severe mental health problem, condition, and I get absolutely no formal recognition, and never have had, in my work, in terms of the care that I give to her on a daily basis, because I didn't give birth to her, and we're not blood relatives. And I would see within, you know, the workplace, women coming and going, maternity leave, I need to leave at 4 to pick my child up. And these are middle-class women. We're not talking about the kind of women who we never, ever see asking for benefits at work, because often the kind of jobs they work in would laugh them out of the staff room. And I've seen lots of people benefit from having children, okay? I think that lots of women have praise and privilege heaped upon them for having children, for being a normal breeder, someone who's moving forward in the world, who's going to provide you and I with our healthcare when we're old. And I think that's something that we need to tackle, as well as the desperately unfair inequality of women who have no help with their childcare and who are left on state benefits and who have no creche facilities or nursery facilities. And then those for whom actually it is an added privilege. And that's the unspoken truth about motherhood. They have far more than I ever have in my caring role.
Yeah, I think you're right to draw that, you know, that comparison, that care involves different kinds of care for different people, and you know, a lot of the care for the elderly or disabled is not validated and recognised, and doesn't have the same financial, legal, and other, you know, privileges and accesses that childcare does. But I would still say that obviously, you know, for families with children, if women are to have, you know, a head start in life and equal opportunities, the whole issue of the inadequacy of childcare, particularly for lower income working class families, is a really fundamental issue.
It is indeed. I mean, we have hugely progressed on that. I mean, I saw just the other day a film which was a stunning film, actually, about a woman's fight to get her union to recognise the rights of mine workers in the 1980s. And she was given an internal examination when she went for the interview to ensure that she wasn't pregnant when she started work there. Now, this was in the 1980s when, you know, you and I, you know, were political activists. We were adults then. We were involved in the political world. And in the meantime, over in the Midwest in America, and no doubt it was happening in some northern towns in the UK, whether illegally or not, these women were being told that if they were pregnant, they couldn't start work because they didn't want to pay the maternity benefits. Now, one can understand very small firms who struggle to keep alive, not wanting to be to be left with a bill for 3 of their employees going off on maternity leave. But if the government supported those small firms properly to do that, then we'd see far more equality for women in the workplace. But I also think it's up to men. I hear time and time again about women who are leaving really good careers, even temporarily, which does mean that their progress is hindered, where their male partners, wouldn't dream of it. They just carry on climbing the ladder, becoming high earners. Maybe in 5 years' time, when they're sick of the nappies, they'll be off with a younger model, and she'll be left without really any great career prospects. So I think that we need to look at the role of men within families still. It really is not yet sorted, even within the privileged families that we come across.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right that a fairer division of domestic labour, where men take responsibility for childcare and domestic tasks, is fundamental to also helping lift the burden, as well as better childcare provision. Do you want to perhaps just look at a couple of other issues that you think we really haven't properly addressed as a society? I mean, to me, it's extraordinary. Women are half of humanity. All of us who are born come from the womb of mothers who've carried us for 9 months. And I just find there's to me, a fundamental disrespect for women in our culture.
Well, I do think that in some ways, homophobia and misogyny are indivisible. I think they rely very much on each other. And I met a very interesting man recently, a young white gay man who's a hip-hop aficionado. He's a rapper. He's brilliant, actually. Q-boy.
Yeah.
He's fantastic. And he said to me that when he's trying to convince people to care about homophobia within some hip-hop and rap, because we know it's not within all, he says, but it's sexist. It relies on sexism. Think about the way that, men are called pussies and, the way that men are feminised in the language used. And, I would also turn that around and say that, also, we rely on homophobia to promote sexism. And the two really are indivisible. And so I think one issue for women is, and certainly as a lesbian feminist, excuse me, I would like to see more support from some of the gay community, the gay male community. I think that there are many political gay men, and I do meet them regularly, but very few seem to think that misogyny is an issue for them. And I do have to stick my neck out and say that partly gay culture is built upon that misogyny, the way that gay men sexualise each other, the way that some gay pornography, it feminises the underdog, relying on the big powerful man, having sex with this tiny, underweight, kind of spotty youth who should be grateful to be raped. I mean, just some of the nastiest kind of racist and misogynistic pornography, which I think reflects some of the way that the gay community has unfortunately gone. Now, obviously, we all have our social scenes. There's, I can be as hedonistic, as the next person, and I certainly don't spend, all of my life doing political acts and giving my money to charity. But I would like to see more support from gay men in terms of connecting with the oppression that women have, and I'd like to see more solidarity, I think, between the two, because
it existed 30 years ago. In the early days of the gay and women's liberation movement,
Indeed.
We were together because the common enemy was straight men.
Indeed.
They were the ones oppressing women.
Yeah.
They're the ones oppressing gay men. And there was that recognition. But you're right, I think it's fallen off the political agenda. And I think you're right, a lot of gay male culture does replicate some of the worst aspects of straight male culture.
I think so. And I mean, if you look, at the fashion industry, if you look at cosmetic surgery, if you look at popular culture, if you look at the music industry, heavily populated by gay men, by out gay men. And it seems that there's no coincidence that some gay men are involved in some of the very industries and some of the very aspects of popular culture that harm women. And I wonder how it's got to that, really. I think it's very sad. And the other thing, of course, is the sex industry. I mean, you mentioned, millions of women all over the world being enslaved in the sex industry. Well, those women are not just trafficked women. I would say that any woman any person with the misfortune to be involved in prostitution, is oppressed and abused. And I think it's really wrong that we use the word choice to describe women, however high up in the chain of the sex industry they are. I've never had to make the choice of being involved in prostitution. All right, at one time in my youth when I was poor, I had a choice between, I don't know, shoplifting and cheque card frauding, and forcing myself through university on a student grant, and getting a job, and I chose the latter. But I was never in as dire a situation as some of these women have, so I think it's wrong of us to ever talk about choice in that way. You could talk about someone selling a kidney to get from the Cameroon to the UK as having made a choice, but we don't really talk about it as choice. And so I wonder why we do about prostitution.
Mm-hmm. Can I just bring you back to you raised the whole issue of, misogyny and homophobia in some aspects of popular culture. Mm-hmm. And I think you've actually hit on something that's pretty fundamental to the way in which a section of young male culture is going. Mm. You're absolutely right that some gangster rap and reggae dancehall music is absolutely replete with constant misogyny and homophobia, constant disrespect for women and gay people. And while I wouldn't say there's a simplistic cause and effect equation, there's got to be some connection, there's got to be some influence. I think that music undoubtedly does help legitimate and fuel negative, disrespectful attitudes towards women. And, with all this, issue around gun crime and the recent stabbings and shootings in London and other cities, I don't think we can separate it from machismo and masculinity.
No, and actually, to qualify what I said earlier, and to make absolutely clear where I'm coming from, I think that straight men have a lot more to answer for in many ways than gay men in terms of the culture that they inhabit. I mean, in calling for the support of gay men, really my first call for support should be from men who could talk to their friends about them beating their partners and abusing their children, reading and consuming pornography and contributing to misogyny in that way. But you're absolutely right about popular culture. I think if you look at the way that young women are influenced by this, that young women are involved in what's been called the raunch culture, as Ariel Levy says, female chauvinist pigs, where women are colluding in their own oppression and are deciding that feminism's not for them. They'd far rather, go around drinking 12 alcopops and showing their midriffs and doing the sort of Jamaican, reggae dancehall jitter and having sex in doorways with men and calling that liberation. Now, these women can do what they like. I mean, if that's the way that they want to spend their Saturday nights, it's not my business. But it's not feminism, and it's not liberation, and it's absolutely not what we have fought for through 3 waves of feminism. In the same way that the black liberationists and the civil rights movement, movers and shakers, did not expect to see young black men creating stereotypes of themselves that is purely horrific, that's right out of slavery, and that perpetuates the most gross racism. I mean, some of the use of racist language on black is not at all, I would argue, liberatory. It's totally a hangover, a legacy of slavery.
Why don't you think we have this debate? I mean, I know there are some sections of the black community where this debate is going on, but they're small and they're marginalised. There is no big conversation within the black community, or more importantly, in the whole of our community, the whole of our society, to address these issues.
Well, interestingly, I've met a great organisation recently based in Peckham, South London, From Boyhood to Manhood. And they're black men working with 6-year-olds to 25-year-olds, and they're helping to educate these young men to become whole human beings and not the stereotype that we see in popular culture, in rap videos and on the streets. And they've got a real chance to do that. Why isn't the government funding organisations like From Boyhood to Manhood everywhere? We have a crisis with young men, not just black men, Asian men, white men, all men. But I think the reason why we don't have a bigger debate is because white liberals are terrified of going anywhere near it. In Boston recently, I met a man called Byron Hurt, who's made a film, Beyond Beats and Rhymes, which looks at misogyny perpetuated through hip-hop and rap. And he himself, he's a black American. He loves hip-hop. He grew up in a black community, and he's talked to young black men about why they celebrate this culture. And he's doing anti-sexist training with organisations. He's bringing the film to the UK. His message is getting around. But there's not enough Byron Hertz. There's not enough Q-Boy. There's not enough From Boyhood to Manhood. You know, this is fundamentally an issue that affects women, but that men should be involved in the struggle against. Sexual violence, women's inequality, it should be a human rights issue and one of social justice, not just left to those who have the time, the patience and the iron stomach, quite frankly, to deal with it on a daily basis.
I think you're right in identifying that people are afraid to engage with these issues and to speak out because they fear that they will be labelled racist or that they will be labelled as censors.
Well, as you have. I mean, with the issue about Karadawi, with the issue about, you know, involving yourself in criticising predominantly black rap gangster misogynists, that for you, I mean, as I'm sure you'd say, the issue wasn't about their ethnicity, it's about their record on human rights, or it's about their misogyny. And, you know, in the same way that as a feminist, I will criticise forced marriage, I will actually say that honour killings are wrong and deeply rooted in misogyny, and I will also identify female genital mutilation as illegal, child abuse, totally unacceptable.
I'm glad you've raised that.
Well, and at the same time...
For those who don't know, at least 130 million women on this planet have been genitally mutilated.
And a lot of them in the UK.
Yeah.
Happening right here, still by Harley Street doctors from their own communities, whether it's Somalian or wherever. You know, this is an issue for all of us. And if we let those children be mutilated on our soil and elsewhere, what's that saying about us? You know, we have harmful cultural practices. White, British-born men honour kill women. They come home and find them in bed with another man. They see their wives flirting once too many times at the club with his friend. He stabs her, he kills her. That's an honour killing. But just because they're not rooted in an Asian community, the police will come in and the police will treat it as a crime. But what's wrong with going into other communities? The law applies. This is a crime. And what are we saying to those women, to those Asian women, to those Somalian women? We're saying we can't protect you because your men are black or your men are Asian. And it's too political, it's too much of a hot potato.
I think, you know, the principle has got to be that human rights are universal and indivisible.
Absolutely.
And wherever women are on this planet, or men, whatever their culture, race, religion, sexuality, you know, we've got to have a principle that we protect the vulnerable.
Well, and that we protect women within those communities as well, because, you know, we know that with group rape in some boroughs in South London, it's been disproportionately committed by young black men and young mixed race men. Now, that's not to say that more black men rape. Certainly not. We're talking about patterns of behaviour, and we're talking about no-go areas for the police. Now, who are their victims? Young black women, young mixed race women. So if we turn a blind eye towards that so that the police can say on their figures we haven't arrested any more black men than we have white men, what are we doing about those women? You go up to Lancashire and West Yorkshire in the north of England, and there are at the moment pimping gangs that are made up of predominantly Asian Muslim men. Now, because of the current climate, again, white liberals and the police are bending over backwards to say, no, don't go there, we don't want to accuse Muslim men. If men are doing it, it's wrong, and we should not be silent about it.
You're absolutely right. You know, we have to have a consistent policy that applies to everyone, and to recognise that when abuses take place in minority communities, the first victims are women and gay people in those communities. Okay, Julie Bindel, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for watching. Join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.